We're all here because we believe a more equitable, humane and sustainable world is possible. This starts with conversation and moves forward with action. And that's the end of my little rant. I'm going to introduce our first speaker. His name is Sunyan Dedic. He's been in the movement for quite a while, has a passion for education and mechatronics and sustainability, and he's going to show us something on education and 3D printing, I believe, which is a fascinating thing if you haven't got into it yet.
Right. Thank you, Craig. Just a general question for the entire audience. Hands up if you have graduated out of high school. Just curious. Right. Now look around, and people out here are very far from a monolithic group. Different ages, totally different generations, probably great variety in the professions we all engage in during our everyday living, ethnicities, nationalities, cultures, etc. And yet all of us have done this thing where we spend a very considerable portion of our lives in this thing called school. 15,000 hours. Now, believe it or not, this was over human history absolutely not the norm for educating oneself. In fact, up until about 200 years ago, most people got educated by entering apprenticeships of some sort. Basically, if somebody had a particular skill, you'd go hang out with them for a long while, watch what they do, imitate it, get better at it. Approximately 1% of people in Europe went to school of any description. That was generally religious schools. Right. So I'm going to basically start with telling you the story of how we came to have universal public school. And it's a very interesting story that most of you probably have not heard. It starts in an unlikely place, a giant battle between Napoleon and the Empire or the Kingdom of Prussia. Now year is 1806. Napoleon is on his way to conquering Europe, and pretty much the next country that stands in his way is one that is more powerful than him. Prussia, being today's Germany, is the fastest growing nation, and they have an army of 250,000, all professional. They have superior logistics, they have superior equipment. Napoleon is coming in with an army of 160,000, so vastly outnumbered, inferior logistics, inferior equipment, and mostly volunteers. But to everyone's surprise, just about every military historian, Napoleon smashes the Prussians. Being an enlightened despot, rather than going out and razing, burning half of Prussia and pillaging the whole place, he basically annexes 2 or 3 territories and as much of the Prussian army as he humanly possibly could, and leaves the institutions of the country intact. Now, the people that run the country are no longer military generals, are no longer monarchs. The monarchs have been exiled. So pretty much the most powerful group in the country are the philosophers, the academics. And in 1809, just 3 years after Napoleon gets in, they start a very big university. It's called University of Berlin. This becomes sort of the center, almost like the government of Russia. Now to give you an idea of how these guys thought, they were the disciples of a guy called Immanuel Kant, a very, very famous philosopher. Now, Kant had this idea about the world that was revolutionary in his time, and in many ways it's true, and in many ways it is empowering. He essentially said reality is subjective. So every one of us, when we pick up a glass, what we're going to experience isn't some objective reality of a glass that we picked up. It depends on other glasses we've seen, it depends on our 5 senses. Our 5 senses are inherently subjective. So every single person in every detail of their life observes reality in a relatively unique individual way. Now they turned this upside down by going, well, a really intelligent person is going to have a superior idea of reality. So we have, Jim over there who's a builder, and John over here who's a university professor, extremely well educated. Well, the extremely well educated person is going to have a superior grasp of reality. And so they said, well, this is why, the elites should dictate to everybody else what they should do, how they should live, what the country should function like. And so they've taken the Kantian philosophy, mixed it with German nationalism. It sounds a bit like Nazism. They said, well, so kind of like Napoleon comes in and conquers Prussia, that they say reality should be managed by superior men. The ideal system of government is just like the system that just conquered a country, Napoleon. It should be governed by an enlightened despot. And these guys got together and they asked themselves a question. Well, we basically had a fantastic army. We were going to be the big European empire, and we got defeated by an inferior force. How do we make sure that never happens again? How do we make sure that our forces are the best fighting forces? And they came up with an idea. Public school. Now, it's actually the father, Frederick the Great, the father of the defeated monarch, that came up with the idea of universal schooling. He did not have enough money to complete the project. Now, this team from the University of Berlin decided that, well, we lost this battle purely for the following reasons. As the forces were facing off against each other, there was a series of orders that the Prussian troops refused. Essentially, it was like, you know, a guy with his 500 men is ordered to march straight into Napoleon's wing and hold him there for a while, and it's a certain death. And so what happened repeatedly is that Prussian forces retreated from very bad positions in terms of maintaining their lives. Essentially, they chose not to kill themselves for the state. And this is a problem. If you want to be a superpower, if you want to have an all-conquering army, you really, really need people that will obey their orders and go die if necessary. And they thought, well, if we get all the kids from all the peasants in all the country and we basically teach them into the greatness of the German nation, give them some myths of history and get this idea that they have no choice than to obey authority, we'll be alright. So here's some quotes. This guy, it took me a while to learn how to pronounce his name, but if any Germans are around here, Johann Gottlieb Fichte. This was the main ideologue. This guy was the Richter, meaning like the head of the University of Berlin, and this is some of the stuff he said. So by means of new education, we want to mold the Germans into a corporate body which shall be stimulated and animated in all its individual members by the same interest. So conformity, we all want the same thing. I should reply that the very recognition of and reliance upon free will is the first mistake of the old system. The old system being those Catholic schools, the Jesuits, and also Lutheran schools that preceded it. And finally, the new education must consist essentially in this, that it completely destroys freedom of will in the soil which it undertakes to cultivate, and produces, on the contrary, a strict necessity in the decisions of the will, the opposite being impossible. So yes, the theory is generally, we want a country full of people that when they're told to do something by their teacher, their boss, their authority, their general, they do exactly as they're told, and they can't even conceive the possibility of doing anything else. And this is the system they came up with. At the bottom were Volksschule. This is schools for 95%. They taught basic literacy, and the focus was on obedience, cooperation, correct attitudes along the rudiments of literacy and myths of state. So essentially, you don't have to know too much. You have to basically be reliable, be on time, do exactly as you're told. You have to love your country, and you'll be right. Up there, the 5%, something like me, an engineer, would be the technical staff of the country. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, public servants, people that would run essential tasks, and they would have high-level skills in their fields. But they weren't essentially given a holistic education. They were still taught a high level of literacy, but it was a passive literacy. So the type that you could follow complex instructions rather than critically analyze them and come up with new ideas yourself. Right up the top, they received what has always been called a liberal education. So that's consisted of the trivium, the quadrivium. Essentially, the guys studied various languages. They studied the art of arguing, critical thinking, and philosophy. So right up top are going to be generals, rulers, the ideologues of the state. 0.5% that essentially ran the country. So this was the first mass education system. This was the original model, and it proliferated around the world for mostly the following two reasons. Firstly, if you build a system so that it provides the ultimate support for a superstate, committed, hard-working people that do exactly as they're told, it's really good if you're a king. Most of Europe was either, monarchs or emperors of some sort. So if you're an authoritarian ruler, you're looking at it going like, yeah, man, I wish my people were like that. I heard, lots of war stories from First World War and the Second World War about how Allied forces or the English always envied the commitment of the German troops. Now you probably have some idea why. And secondly, Germans came up with a genius idea at the University of Leipzig and University of Berlin. They invented what we today call the PhD system. And so, intelligent people, students from all around the world, who wanted to learn theory of psychology, philosophy, education, who wanted to, reach the highest level of education, wound up going to Leipzig and Berlin to get their PhD, where they learned all about Russian schooling. And so this became a model that got copied the most around the world. In fact, I read somewhere that as far as Japan, most of Japan's actual constitution at one stage was virtually copied from the Prussian constitution because their delegations were so impressed with the German system. Right, now we're going to do 4 quantum leaps, because if we talked about history of education, I could be here for another 2 hours. So I'm going to say basically 4 major influences on our education that have been around since then. The first being this guy, Wilhelm Wundt. He's the father of experimental psychology. Now, before him, psychology was an area of philosophy. You would basically theorize about the nature of life and good and evil, and you'd read Plato and Aristotle, and then you'd make determinations that were psychological in nature. This guy said, no, thinking is like a mechanistic process. He was totally anti-metaphysical, so we are just machines, animals, and he brought the scientific method. Essentially, the picture there is of his laboratory, where he'd get people to sit, he'd blindfold them, and ask them he'd put a ball in their lap and say, what are your sensations? The idea was he would get raw data, not human interpretations. So humans were like empty vessels, like machines that could be programmed. So even though his direct methods were never totally applicable, he did bring this idea of a scientifically controlled experiment to psychology in a classroom where they should try many, many different methods until they discovered something that worked. Next up, a guy that wasn't really involved in education, but he really changed what education had to be about pretty drastically. Frederick Taylor, he started off as, a member of the lower classes, worked in factories, worked his way up, became an engineer, and he developed a system by which, you used to have a system where there'd be a team of 5 people who'd put together a car in a factory from scratch, and you knew all about cars, and you knew all about various mechanisms inside the car. And he just said, no, we could have 20 people, and they'd be just like that on the Ford production line. Tuck, tuck, tuck. You put in one nail, you put in the next thing, you put in the next thing. And he reduced what used to be a really, really skilled, complex tasks in factories that the workers had to operate. He reduced them to totally menial mechanical jobs. So the workers became replaceable, anybody could come in, anybody could do the job. And that really changed the requirements of schooling, because no longer did you need people with these fairly advanced, complex skills to work in factories. You could just about get anyone, so long as they never got bored and worked really hard. And so the schools responded to that. Now, at the same, right up next to it is this guy, probably the most influential out of all the characters I stated. Most of you probably heard of B.F. Skinner. He is the pioneer, the founder of behaviorism. He's the guy that started operant conditioning. And the idea behind behaviorism is this. If you set up a system of fairly small rewards and punishments for behavior, you will reinforce the behaviors you want. But you will not only encourage the child to exhibit a certain type of behavior, that type of behavior becomes automatic. Let's say your child comes home and and said, well, you can't have dinner until you wash your hands. The reaction of coming home and washing your hands before dinner is not going to have anything to do with germs or politeness in their mind. And in a few months it will become like an automatic thing. They just do. They don't think about it, they just do. And essentially, that is Skinner in a Skinner box, who got rats and pigeons to do all sorts of crazy, complicated things by, at the right time, encouraging certain behaviors. So you got pigeons spinning around, you got rats running ever more complex mazes and so on. I do have a video, which hopefully I can run. Do pay close attention. Like this is, he pretty much explains his theory in education. This was what academics at university taught every single teacher in the world for probably some 30, 40 years.
You've written that our educational environments are defective. How would teachers within this environment go about helping the child modify his learning behavior?
Well, you have to do it, first of all, by constructing the kind of environment that will bring the child under some kind of control. If you go into a disrupted classroom where the kids are late in arriving and they run around the room and so on, the teacher may be completely out of control there. What you have to do is to set up some very conspicuous rewarding or reinforcing contingencies, and you can do it by tokens or with credit points or with personal approval or something of that kind. Make sure that the child is reinforced for coming to school, for sitting down, getting to work, and learning something. Now, you may have to make it very explicit to begin with, something as conspicuous as a token that he can pocket in exchange for something at lunch or something like that. But you don't want that to go on forever. You don't want kids to live their lives just to collect tokens, any more than we want people to live their lives just collecting money. It's something else again. But you can then change from a token system to a credit system, from a credit system just to a bit of approval, a pat on the back, but then you want to get rid of that also and have the child come under the control of the instructional materials he's working with. Now, I don't think you're going to do that by finding things that are naturally interesting to the child. There are naturally interesting things, but the child is there to learn behaviors which will pay off naturally only much later in his life. For example, beginning reading is not very rewarding. You can put four-color pictures on every page of your reader and that kind of thing, but there are ways in which you can work out contingencies so the child is successful very quickly. It may be quite arbitrary. You may get some feedback that this is the correct name for that object and so on. But with these spurious contingencies, call them anything you like, you can begin to build up fluent reading behavior, and then the child will begin to get reinforced, as we all are, from reading enjoyable things. But you can't move to the enjoyable things immediately because they aren't enjoyable. He hasn't acquired enough behavior to read enjoyably. So you set up artificial contingencies, which might be just approval, but could be much better than that, to build the behaviors which then come under the control of the natural contingencies built into books. We read books for the rewarding things that happen when we read. And you can't start there, but that's where you want the child to move as fast as possible.
What are the range of positive reinforcers open to a school? It seems to me schools are operating in a very different way than the one you just described.
Yes, when you ask yourself as a teacher, as I have at the college level, what have I got that my students want? It's sometimes a pretty discouraging question. But you can discover things which will be reinforcing to students at any level. And that has been done. A great deal of progress has been made. There are things in an ordinary, even say a ghetto classroom, lower grades or high school, that can be used as reinforcers. You can have special foods at lunchtime, access to play space, privileges to associate with other kids of your choice. More and more of these things have been brought into play as the kinds of contrived reinforcers that can be used temporarily to get the kinds of behavior which will then eventually have their own natural consequences which will be reinforcing. That can be done. Fortunately for us all, the human organism is reinforced just for being successful with something. And that has had survival value, and it can be used. If you design instructional materials properly, and I would say that programmed instruction is an example, then mere progress is reinforcing.
Right. Now, two important things. That earlier in that talk, he said children are not inherently curious. Like, no, they exhibit some curious behavior, and you give them some cookies at that time, and that's how you become curious. Like, you would never learn how to read unless at the correct times when you attempt to read, your mother pats you on the back, hugs you, and encourages you. So technically, humans are these relatively blank, randomized slates of behavior, and you cherry pick what to reward and what to punish, and then you form a human being. And the irony is, to a large extent, this works. And I'll give you two unbelievable applications of Skinner's behaviors. First is, what do you call them, like multiplayer, like adventure multiplayer games, RPGs? RPGs, like World of Warcraft. See, Skinner discovered that if you carefully schedule rewards, so people do certain effort and then they get rewards, and especially if they're randomized, that they result in totally compulsive behavior. And this is what World of Warcraft is built on. You do certain activities and then you get more rewards, and your rewards are random. You never know when you're going to get them. This is the principle of a slot machine. You pull it up, even though you're getting 90 cents for every dollar you put in, it comes back at completely random intervals, and if it's timed just right, it will keep you making that behavior. In fact, even rats and monkeys fall for slot machines. They would rather have a randomized thing where their chances are 40% than something that's 50% but gives them every 1 out of 2 for food. And it just struck me that if you're conditioned and rewarded to always respond to incentives, so like if you get a good mark if you do what the teacher says, you get stars, you get good marks in the test. Well, there are incentives in our economy that would explain a whole lot of evil that's going on in the world. I mean, the banks are siphoning off, inordinate amounts of wealth away from poorer nations. There's virtually genocide being committed. But quite possibly these people are, not harboring any evil intentions. They're quite literally having bonuses to aim for, and they're rewarded for their actions of directing more money towards their corporate, and they're not punished if they do something immoral. And so it becomes just like that slot machine player going click, 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 and they're quite possibly addicted to making more money and getting more bonuses and more bonuses, without necessarily going, I really want to screw those Africans out of all that food because we'd be better off sold at some artificially scarce price. Just a food for thought there. Next big idea, as you see, we're actually getting more positive. Skinner's stuff worked, but he wasn't as evil as the original Russian founders of education. This guy is called Jean Piaget, and he went back to Kant's principle. Yes, reality is subjective. We all understand the world through things that we've already grasped in our own experience. And his philosophy put the child at the center of the learning. Meaning that, if you want to teach a kid about something, you better know more about that kid so you can relate it to some experience that they've previously had. We'll talk more about constructivism, so I'm just going to breeze past it. This guy essentially worked with really, really young kids, and one of the famous experiments that he did is he pretty much concluded that if you take a toddler and you put a doll in front of it and put a doll away, they actually believe that the doll has disappeared. It's not gone out of sight, it's actually physically disappeared. And they are sort of making sense of reality from what they know. It's here, it's not there, and it gets more complex and more interesting. But, and by now you're probably wondering, okay, you've told us all about these really evil people that founded schools originally, but, I've been to universities and they're really, really full of really nice people who want the best for their kids, your kids. And that's really true. That's where I studied. That's University of Monash, Faculty of Education. And I could say, it's generally people that organize your schools, the administrators. Their competence you can debate, but their intentions are almost overwhelmingly good. But they are hampered by some inherent limitations. Firstly, historically, when Skinner was around, they were all behaviorists. This was what they got taught. That was the universal theory of learning. They got told this is how kids learn. This is what you're going to teach teachers. So teachers went to classes going, yes, I'm just going to reward good behaviors, punish bad behaviors, and kids are going to turn out just fine. And so on and so on. Now, secondly, school research is limited by the standard parameters of school. It's given that you're going to group kids of the same age, that you're going to group learning material into separate subjects. It's given that there's going to be these artificial time limits called classes. It is given that it's not going to be, an endless quest for more knowledge, that there's going to be curriculum limitations, and it's also given that schooling is going to be full-time. For instance, I really looked into research into homeschooling, and that research virtually doesn't exist. I think nobody wants to fund it. So all research actually starts off with an assumption, yes, we have a school, the school works the way the school works. And then after that generates data. Now that data is quite often good and interesting. And while we're here, this is the Australian National Curriculum Stated Purpose of Education. I'm not going to read these out, but one thing that did surprise me is that there was a huge stress on social relationships, rights and responsibilities of being global citizens, and again, skills and behaviors. The one that did shock me, and which I read was from the Victorian Essential Learning Standards 2009, it said students are subjected to more competitive standards and institutionalized forms of management. Motivation is extrinsic, dependent on context that is perceived as valuable. So this was for year 8 to 10 kids. School is about them being subjected to institutionalized forms of management. It's not necessarily about them learning how to think and learning how the world works. It is about there are bosses, there's organization, there's rules, there's things you do when you do them as you're told. This is institutionalized forms of management. And finally, motivation is increasingly extrinsic. It's like Skinnerian principles. So you're not motivated by what you feel inside, what your passions are, what you're curious about. You're motivated about what the curriculum says is important. You're motivated by what your teacher says is in the test. And I have worked as a teacher now only for one term, but that is what shocked me more than anything. I had a class of kids that many of them did maths a year advanced. So in a school of, in a year 10 generation of 300, possibly 10 of the smartest kids are in my class. And I say, how would you like to build something that glows in the dark or responds to your voice and lights up? And I don't get too much of an interesting reaction, but I say, well, this is worth 20% of the test, and they start paying attention, writing it down, and asking me questions. And then I find that quite alarming, that really, really smart kids in school are more concerned about scoring points on the test than things that are genuinely interesting, that they can actually do tomorrow, and potentially that will open up their opportunities. And that's what school does. Now, I thought after all of this, what's my best analogy to the purpose of school? Like, how would I interpret everything that was said? And I came up with the idea of a Lego block. Now, a Lego block is a very useful object. It supports blocks above it supports blocks below it. It can be used in hundreds of applications. It fits just right into, all kinds of different structures. Corporations, bureaucracies, businesses, etc. It's reliable. It's replaceable. You can get different Lego blocks to replace the Lego blocks you already have. And if you produce a great number of Lego blocks, you can build really complex structures. And so the people that essentially run society, that run major corporations, like this idea of a standardized student with standardized skills, definitely reliable. So down the bottom, I had a list that's kind of universal for all schools, and up top is the type of stuff, while I learned to be an engineer, the type of stuff I did. So at the bottom we have like low active literacy, compliance, obedience, conformist, minimal intrinsic motivation. You mentioned that earlier. Now, that I added in because of low active literacy. People are inherently easy to convince. I mean, you have millions of people around the world buying stuff that does no benefit to them whatsoever because the ads had like nice shiny colors and famous actors. You have them voting for politicians who most definitely do not have their best interests at heart. Again, it's because the right things are said, because they're not told to critically analyze information that's coming at them. But even the white-collar workers are not told to critically analyze. Now, highly specialized knowledge, say as an engineer, I knew all about engineering, making stuff. These are quite advanced tasks, require a lot of maths and skills. But not a lot about how a company works, how it's managed, what incentives it operates under, what's legal restraints, who owns it. Prioritizing job over personal life. I have a question. How many people can relate to this? How many people do you know that are exceedingly competent in their professional life? You know, their desk is super neat, their work is world class, and that type of active management doesn't seem to apply to their lives. You know, they probably struggle to keep fit, have a problem with alcohol or some prescription drug, and their relationships in their private life are a whole lot worse than their relationship with fellow professionals at work. The idea is that Lego block does focus on its primary function, which is to fit whatever that corporation or bureaucracy, government requires. Of course, these Lego blocks can be managed easily. They obey rules, and they also follow, they can be managers. The ideal white-collar employee can manage a few people, does exactly as he's told right above. And this is kind of, honestly, I enjoy my job as an engineer, but that's the notion of middle management was kind of what drove me out of it more than anything else. Again, high extrinsic motivation. When those bonuses are set at the end of the year, you will do whatever it takes to achieve them. Creative within set boundaries. Yeah, sure, people are meant to be creative when they're designing something, you know, possibly make it operate on some novel principle that no one used before. But you shouldn't be creative when interpreting the company reports and asking tough questions about, well, you know, who's benefiting from our hard work and how come that even though our profits are so much higher than last year, we've had no investment for these new projects, and, you know, if I've made the company 10 million, why did my salary go up 5%? You know, the questions like that, you should probably not be too creative about rethinking the system. Okay. Now that I've ranted about the educational system, here is a couple of interesting positive things that I've learned from it. So there'll be three of them. The first would be what I consider a cause for learning. The second will be a method of learning, which is more or less recognized as the method by which people learn all around the world. And the last would be, well, a good place to start your learning. For all individuals, we're all different, and the notion that a standardized curriculum doesn't make sense begs the question, are there things that we actually should all know? I'll try to answer that. So the first, this was probably the most interesting lecture I ever had at uni. It was about gifted children. And I walked in, I sat down, and this woman started explaining that this is going to be a lecture about gifted children, and they said, oh, you know, we have all these smart kids that get everything instantly, but their lives are really tough. You know, they get bored easily, and sometimes they just give up on school because they don't find it interesting. They're usually bullied. They have to pretend to not be interested. They actually have to dumb themselves down very often, and poor gifted kids, and how are we going to deal with them? And I just thought to myself, you know what, if somebody, you know, was 10 years old and played golf better than any 10-year-old that ever played golf, people would be gathering up going like, hey, what's this kid doing? I want to teach my kid to do what that kid's doing. If we do the same, you know, like Forbes publishes what CEOs have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and millions of people around the world imitate it. And yet we've got this class of really, really smart kids, and it's a question of, oh, well, how are we going to deal with them? You know, like their life's tough. Not like, hey, aren't we in the business of making kids smart? Shouldn't we be imitating what they do? So I went through this list. Unusual alertness, long attention span, high activity level, less need for sleep, keen sense of observation, extreme curiosity, excellent memory, advanced progression through developmental milestones, early onset of language, rapid learning ability, sensitivity both emotional and physical, preference for older companions. Anyway, I went through this list and I thought, like, well, cause and effect. If learning is the effect, like, is there a cause? Is there a causal relationship? Does one seem to cause most of them? In my view, it's extreme curiosity. I think this is the, out of all characteristics of dominant presence in gifted children, really intelligent kids, I think this is the dominant one. Extreme curiosity is defined a compulsive need or a desire to know more about yourself and your environment. So follow me here. If this is what I hypothesized, and mind you, the academics didn't give me a high distinction in this essay, so hopefully it's going to make sense to you. Right, extreme curiosity. If you're really extremely curious about the world in which you live, you're going to be unusually alert. Like, you're really going to be looking around, trying to figure stuff out. You're going to have a preference for older companions because they know stuff. They know way more than kids, so hence you really want to hang out with them. They can teach you stuff. Well, you're going to have a high activity level because you're not really going to learn much sitting still. Like, you kind of got to go around and explore stuff. But unusual alertness leads to a keen sense of observation, and a keen sense of observation leads to a long attention span. If you have a long attention span and you're highly active, then obviously you're going to have a higher learning ability. And the more you learn, the more sort of reference points in your data, the more complex your thinking can be, and there is therefore abstract thinking. Now, preference for older companions, well, they speak, don't they? So that kind of does tie in with early onset of language. If you start speaking early, then you're going to be more interested in books, and so on and so on. So, I don't know, now, like, does it make sense that curiosity is sort of the dominant thing that makes people smart? I'd say yes. And I do have papers in my PC with like a lot of references for all three of these claims. But basically, the educational research I mentioned to you earlier about from academia does show all of the following. Curiosity is positively correlated with almost every criteria of intellectual ability. IQ tests, convergent thinking, divergent thinking. Now, grade 1 and 2 kids that go to school, this is basically, scientists looking at kids 24/7 through cameras and looking at their behavior and observing, okay, this is an expression of curiosity, that they're exploring something, they're asking questions. Grade 1 and 2 kids show more curiosity at home than in school. And in grades 3, grades 5, and grade 7, those same criteria for behaviors, they actually drop. I think it was 15% for every 2 years or 15% every year. But so curiosity is proportional to intelligence. Kids are more curious at home than in school. And as you get older and progress through grades, you get less curious. So I don't know, connect the dots. You may conclude that, at least in some way, school does dumb you down by making you less curious about the world in which you live. This is a bit too small to read, but this is my illustration of constructivism. And I talked about constructivism a minute earlier, Jean Piaget. We construct meaning of the world from what we already know. So I thought, like, what could I do as an example? I think at the time, on the table was a coffee stain, and I wrote the word down, evaporation. Now, in my mind, evaporation associates with rain and clouds and sweating, polar bonding, all of this molecular science, thermodynamics, Brownian motion, dynamic equilibrium, and then it associates with Melbourne where it rains a lot, my veggie garden, and so on and so on. But evaporation is a good example because we can't walk out of our door without, say, observing evaporation. So things that are part of our everyday experience are things that we have a lot of reference points for, just like in that network, and things that are going to be easy to learn. But then there's some examples in school where we don't have, kids learn this stuff, and I don't think there's any reference points for this. Medieval history, I don't know, kids in the schools in which I teach. I think all of year 9 is learning about medieval history. I don't know, are there any medieval buildings around Melbourne? Like, no? Any people speaking in that dialect? Not really. There is no church gathering, nobody's being burned at the stake. It's really hard to relate to that. They don't observe medieval history when they go out the door, not at least in Australia. Languages, French and Italian. I reckon most of these kids, at least 90% of them are never going to wind up going to France and Italy. And if they did wind up going to France and Italy, they'd learn French and Italian way quicker than they ever did in school. And yet, hands up if you have one of these, like a mobile phone. Yeah, most people. They have apps. The apps are written in programming languages. Everything on here is written in programming languages. Every single person in the world is accessing things that operate on programming languages every single day. And yet, what, like 5% of all kids learn programming languages? That doesn't make too much sense. Well, in my subject, I teach maths and systems engineering. Complex number is vector geometry. Like, kids ask me like, oh, when am I ever going to need this? And I'm like, well, look, you know, like if you build transformers one day, no, like they're not building transformers in year 10. I think a better time to learn a lot of the theoretical maths is really close to or at the same time as you're doing the applications of it. So generally embedding it into something where you have a context. And again, the problem with, if your learning is recognized universally to be a complex mesh network of your theoretical understanding and your personal experience of the world, then how much sense does it make in separating all of these things into 3 different subjects, and then lifestyle and travel, and then daily life? I mean, they're usually going to pick one out of the 3 sciences, and so like most of those scientific concepts that are a bit more complex to understand would not come to them easily. And just to give you some idea of how this network is used, well, let's say, I mean, I've got here like my veggie garden, water cycle. From knowing what I know, if somebody looked at that, and somebody knew what I know roughly, they'd have a pretty good idea about how they could teach me about tornadoes or massive storms. And the way I've learned about tornadoes and massive storms would probably have some involvement of, you know, my scientific background, like thermodynamics or smoke-filled rooms in European bars, but someone else who maybe grew up next to the sea will have cloud formations in their mind, you know, these sudden changes in temperature, things like that. So that covers constructivism. Now, we mentioned 2 things, curiosity driving learning and constructivism being, say, a method by which kids learn. And this is 2 examples of curious kids doing amazing things with very little resources. That there is a kid called Sebastian Alegria. He's a 14-year-old Chilean boy. He discovered the best earthquake warning device in Chile, playing with a $50 microcontroller that is open source and online. He actually did it before a team of 50 scientists. That guy, Jack Andraka, 15-year-old kid, invented the best possible method on planet Earth for testing pancreatic cancer. Previously, it cost $800 and had 70% accuracy. This kid made it for 15 cents, 99.9% accuracy. Now, he used nothing but Google and Wikipedia. He couldn't get access to a lab. He actually had to write to 200 labs around America until somebody opened the doors for him. And it took him 6 months, and he had the best method in the world of detecting pancreatic cancer. And he kind of had, you know, he was on a tangent, he wanted to learn. I think his uncle had pancreatic cancer, he got curious about it, and one thing led to another. And this is that kind of spirit of free inquiry, unbroken time, not separated into subjects. You sort of do your own thing, and you're given an abundance of resources, and this is how people learn. You had a lot of curiosity, and then got them over the line. So, I'll conclude with this slide. Okay, so we all learn on a very, very individual basis, and we're all driven by our curiosity. Is there something universal that we should all know? And I would say yes. We should have some understanding of what it means to be human. You know, our basic human needs, food, water, shelter, energy. The nature of our bodies, our 5 senses, their limitations, nutrition, and some theory of human nature. And I'll end with a few questions. You know, if we understood how our basic needs are met, if we understood how our food was prepared, where it came from, how it was grown, who owned it, who profited from it, you know, would Monsanto be a thriving corporation? You know, if we had some sensible idea about nutrition, you know, what would happen to McDonald's? You know, if people had a pretty clear idea of what it is that their body needs. Likewise, if we understood our evolutionary drives, like our drives to, you know, not die, or a drive to have sex, would it be much harder for people to sell us stuff on the basis of telling us you will get laid if you buy my product, or, you know, protect your family in case of a tragedy? And in a world where we better understood what it meant to be human, and we took that as a starting point for for an education, I think it'll be a better one. Anyway, that's that. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, we're going to have a few minutes for questions, and then we're going to have a short break in the next presentation. Now, if you have a question, stick your paw up, and I'll come around with the wireless so everyone can hear the question, and Sanjay will respond. Sanjay will respond up here. Have we got any questions for Sanjay for now? I'll come out. Again, just don't be afraid. If you're thinking it, probably someone else is too.
Do you think that emotional intelligence is something that also, is as important as intellect?
It's emotional intelligence is, I'm afraid I can't really give you, studies that show that kids in certain type of life circumstances have a higher emotion. It's something that's really, really hard to measure. But, I would say the need number 5 was relationships. We are social animals. If you live on planet Earth and you can't count, if you don't have people who have your best interest at heart, you're going to struggle to survive. In fact, much of our success in life is dependent on how good our relationships are to people, how well we know who to trust, how well we know who to count on, how effectively we work with people. So, is emotional intelligence important? Yeah, it's a key component of that, and yeah, you need it to survive and thrive in the world. But in terms of, do I have empirical data for that? Not at the moment. Thank you.
Any other questions? I've got a quick one for you.
Yeah, go for it.
So when you talked about Immanuel Kant's idea of education and then Victor's education as well with the 3-tiered system, how far does that go back? Because could that be related to Plato's tripartite version of the state and its soul?
Well, Kant died in, I think, 1902. Sorry?
Kant's older, I think he's 18.
Yeah, I think he died 7 years before Victor got to the head of the university. And essentially, what they inherited from him was this idea of subjective reality. The ideas of ultranationalism, of statism and that, I think were almost more inherited from Napoleon, who did actually start a huge wave of people being ever more tribal, ever more nationalistic around Europe.
Okay, interesting, because I think there might be a link between what you talked about with those 3 levels of education and a very old idea of
Plato's Republic?
Guardians, auxiliaries and artisans, which is, the elites, the people who work in professional roles, and then the workers on the bottom, which is very interesting. If we haven't got any more questions, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we're going to come back with the second presentation.